Before we begin, take a breath. This isn't just a podcast, it's a new way to think, speak, and live in English. Welcome to Confluent Podcast, where words flow, confidence grows, and every sip brings you closer to fluency.
Oh, I like that.
Right. So imagine pulling your child out of the classroom, throwing away all the standardized textbooks, and just, I don't know, letting them spend 3 weeks doing nothing but staring at bugs in the backyard.
Which, to most of us, sounds literally like educational neglect.
Exactly. But imagine that a decade later, that exact same kid ends up with higher SAT scores and better reading comprehension than their peers who sat at a desk for 12 years.
Yeah, and today we are unpacking the mechanics behind that exact scenario.
We really are. We're taking a deep dive into the philosophy and the daily realities of alternative education, heavily leaning on the frameworks presented in Gail Nagasako's book, Homeschooling, Why and How.
Which is just a fascinating text to unpack, honestly, because it fundamentally dismantles everything we assume about human development.
It really does.
Whether you have children, plan to, or you're just, curious about how the human brain actually acquires knowledge, Nagasako's work challenges the systemic design of mass schooling.
Yeah.
It forces us to separate the biological reality of learning from the institutional structures we've built to manage, like large populations of kids.
Absolutely. And we should state clearly up front that our goal today is to impartially explore these ideas.
Right, because Nagasako holds some incredibly harsh, uncompromising views on traditional schooling.
Very harsh. And we'll lay those out so you can understand the foundation of her argument. We aren't here to endorse or condemn the modern school system, but we are absolutely going to pull apart the why and how behind her claims.
Definitely.
So the most logical place to start is the single biggest barrier to entry for any parent considering this path, which is the terror of academic failure.
Oh, yeah, the absolute dread.
The fear that stepping off the conveyor belt means the child is instantly going to fall behind.
Right, but that fear assumes the conveyor belt is the most efficient method of transportation. Nagasako's data tells a totally different story.
What do the numbers actually say?
Well, statistically, homeschoolers consistently outscore their traditionally schooled peers, particularly in foundational subjects like reading and math.
Really? So the exact opposite of what parents are terrified of.
Exactly. And to understand why, we have to look at the cognitive science of tailored pacing versus generalized averaging.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
So in a room of 30 students, a teacher has no choice but to teach to the mathematical average of the room. By definition, a large percentage of those brains are either bored because the pace is too slow or they're completely lost because it's way too fast.
Right, it's just the sheer math of individual attention. I mean, think of a massive, incredibly crowded, understaffed restaurant.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah, you could hire a Michelin star chef and the most highly trained servers in the entire world, but if you assign one waiter to 40 tables simultaneously, it is physically impossible to provide high-quality, personalized service.
Orders get dropped, people wait too long.
Exactly. The quality of the food doesn't even matter if the delivery system is just totally overwhelmed. When you bring the education into the home, you are essentially swapping that chaotic dining room for a private chef.
Which fundamentally changes the cognitive load on the learner. When a child has a dedicated facilitator, the parent, they can speed through concepts their brain naturally grasps.
Right.
And then they can spend an extended stress-free week on a math concept that creates friction. And there's no social pressure of 30 peers staring at them while they struggle.
That makes total sense.
Yeah, and if you stretch the timeline back through human history, the family unit as the primary educational hub was the standard for thousands of years. The industrialized, mass schooling model is basically a recent historical anomaly.
Wow, yeah, when you frame it like that. So if the academic outcomes are robust, the immediate logistical question becomes how a parent actually operates this day-to-day.
Right, the logistics are scary.
Because my instinct would be to go out, buy a giant whiteboard, set an alarm for 8 a.m., and try to recreate a miniature middle school in my dining room.
Which sounds awful.
It sounds like a fast track to mutual resentment.
It really is. Trying to copy the institutional model at home is the most common trap for beginners. Nagasako outlines a wide spectrum of approaches in the book.
Okay.
While highly structured school at home works for certain, like highly organized personalities, the book advocates heavily for the opposite extreme,
Which is?
a concept known as unschooling.
Unschooling.
Yeah, and unschooling completely abandons rigid time blocks and standardized curricula. It favors flexible, project-based learning driven entirely by the child's intrinsic motivation.
Okay, so how do you even start that?
The book suggests that the very first step of homeschooling should be a sit-down meeting with your children to assess their personal goals and interests. You're making them active partners rather than subjects reporting to a dictator.
Oh, wow. So going back to the bug example.
Right. If a 5-year-old says they want to learn about bugs, you don't schedule 20 minutes of insect studies for Thursday. You completely lean into it.
You make it the whole focus.
Exactly. You make bugs the central node of the web. You read entomology books to build literacy. You calculate the ratios of spider legs to beetle legs to teach basic math.
Okay, but let me play devil's advocate here for a second.
Please do.
Because if you let a kid just follow their impulses, how does that translate to a comprehensive education? Don't they end up with massive gaps in their knowledge? I mean, staring at ants doesn't teach you the geopolitical causes of World War I.
That is the most common critique of self-directed learning, without a doubt. But the neurological mechanism at play here is crucial. When a child is intrinsically motivated, when they genuinely want to know how an anthill functions, their brain releases dopamine.
Right, the reward chemical.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that dopamine physically strengthens the neural pathways responsible for memory retention. So when education is driven by curiosity, the child actually learns how to learn.
Ah, I see.
Yeah, if they want to categorize those bugs, they are forced to learn scientific classification. They have to improve their reading comprehension just to understand the field guide. The specific topic, the bug, is just the Trojan horse for teaching the mechanics of independent learning.
That is brilliant. It shifts them from passive consumers to active investigators.
Right.
Because in a standard classroom, the incentive structure is entirely extrinsic. You memorize the capitals of Europe because there's a test on Friday, and you want a good grade to avoid punishment.
And what happens right after the test?
The second the test is over, the brain dumps the data.
Exactly, because it wasn't flagged as genuinely useful for survival or personal interest. Unschooling seems to be about building the engine of curiosity so they can drive themselves absolutely anywhere.
I love that phrase, the engine of curiosity.
And furthermore, when you remove the artificial boundary of school hours, learning becomes a constant state of being rather than a chore you clock in and out of.
Right.
But this naturally brings up a major roadblock for parents. Building that engine of curiosity is great, but what happens when the child's interests surpass the parent's actual knowledge base?
Yeah, my immediate reaction to that scenario is sheer terror. If my teenager decides they want to master organic chemistry or advanced trigonometry, we are both failing.
It's intimidating.
Totally. The idea that a parent has to be an omniscient database of human knowledge is paralyzing.
Well, Nagasako's framework fundamentally rejects the idea that you need a master's degree in every subject.
Really?
Yeah. The argument is that a parent really only needs to ensure the absolute mastery of 2 foundational skills.
Just two.
Just 2. The first is reading. It's the master key. If a human being possesses high-level reading comprehension, they have the ability to teach themselves virtually any other subject in existence.
That makes sense. And what's the second?
The second skill is what the book refers to as basic business and money math.
Like balancing a checkbook.
Exactly. We're talking about the practical arithmetic required to navigate adult life. Fractions, decimals, percentages, compounding interest, calculating taxes.
So skipping the high-level theoretical stuff.
Right. The author makes the point that while advanced calculus is a beautiful discipline, and it's definitely necessary for structural engineers, it is not a prerequisite for a functional, successful human life.
That is a huge relief to hear. But what if they do want to be an engineer?
Well, we live in an era of unprecedented access to information. If your child develops a passion for quantum physics, you outsource.
Okay.
You utilize local library networks, hire specialized tutors, or leverage online platforms like Khan Academy, which offer comprehensive university-level coursework for completely free.
So the parent transitions from being the sole source of knowledge to basically becoming a resource manager.
Exactly. You're facilitating, not lecturing.
Which also completely dismantles the myth that homeschoolers are locked out of higher education. Because the data shows they actually over-index on college entrance exams like the SAT and ACT.
They really do. Universities often actively recruit self-directed learners because they don't require the hand-holding that many traditionally schooled freshmen do.
Right. And if a piece of paper is just a bureaucratic necessity, securing a GED is a trivial hurdle for a well-read student.
Absolutely. And there is also a huge psychological benefit to the parent not knowing everything.
Oh, really? How so?
When a child asks a complex question and the parent responds with, "I have absolutely no idea, let's figure it out together," it models vulnerability.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, you are demonstrating the research process in real time. Seeing an adult admit ignorance and then actively hunt for the answer is a far more valuable life lesson than pretending adults are infallible authority figures.
It totally normalizes not knowing things, which is huge for kids. So if academics are handled, test scores are statistically stronger, and the burden of being a genius is removed from the parent.
Right.
But if you bring this topic up at a dinner party, the conversation will inevitably pivot to the great societal obsession, which is socialization.
The big S word.
Right. The assumption is that kids kept out of the classroom will turn into awkward hermits who just don't know how to function in society.
Yeah, and this is where Nagasako's text uses incredibly stark language, and we should frame this clearly as the author's perspective.
Yes, important to note.
The book portrays the traditional school socialization model, not just as flawed, but as actively damaging.
Wow.
It characterizes schools as environments operating on a prison mentality that inherently breeds bullying and peer coercion. The author goes as far as describing these institutions as, quote, hateful torture centers.
Hateful torture centers. That is
Yeah.
intense imagery.
Very intense. They argue children are segregated strictly by age and forced into unnatural behavioral compliance under the threat of authority.
I mean, stripping away the emotionally charged language, the core argument does make logical sense. Locking 38-year-olds in a room for 7 hours a day, only allowing them to speak when holding a hand in the air, is not an accurate simulation of adult society.
Not at all.
Because in the real world, you interact with people older than you, younger than you, with different authority levels and incredibly diverse backgrounds.
Exactly. True socialization, according to the framework, happens organically in the real world. It happens through interactions with extended family, running errands, neighborhood play, and mixed-age community groups.
It's about integration, not isolation.
Right. The book actually references a powerful example of organic skill building and socialization by looking at the Gracie family.
Oh, the legendary pioneers of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.
Yes. There's a specific reference to a documentary called Choke, which follows Rickson Gracie. The film shows him playfully rolling around on the living room mat with his baby boy, Kron. And he's not blowing a whistle or forcing the toddler to run rigid drills. He's gently putting him into holds, turning it into a relaxed, deeply connected game.
Right, and that organic, playful bonding naturally evolved into a profound passion because Kron Gracie eventually became a world-class professional athlete himself.
Exactly. The skill and the discipline were transferred through intimate connection, not institutional coercion.
That is such a powerful distinction, and that concept of organic environment ties directly into another major theme. Nagasako defends fiercely, right?
Oh, yes. The absolute necessity of boredom.
Which completely flies in the face of modern parenting. Because if a kid today complains they are bored, the immediate adult reflex is absolute panic.
Total panic.
We feel this overwhelming obligation to entertain them, hand them a tablet, turn on a documentary, schedule a play date. We operate under the assumption that an idle brain is a decaying brain.
And neuroscientists would strongly disagree with that assumption. They point to what is known as the default mode network, or the DMN.
The DMN, what is that?
It's the brain's background processing system, and it only activates when we are not actively focused on a task or consuming external stimuli.
Interesting.
When you constantly feed a child entertainment, their brain remains in a state of passive consumption. Boredom isn't a void. It is an incubation chamber. It is the necessary friction that forces the brain to generate its own ideas.
So when a kid whines that they have absolutely nothing to do, the most developmentally healthy response is to essentially say, good, figure it out.
Exactly. By forcing them to sit in that discomfort, you are starving them of external dopamine until their imagination is forced to kick in to entertain itself.
All right.
They wander into the backyard, pick up a stick, and suddenly it's a sword, and they are inventing a complex narrative. They become creators. Constant entertainment anesthetizes the imagination.
Okay, I love the idyllic picture of kids inventing worlds with sticks and organically learning martial arts in the living room.
Right, it sounds perfect.
But I want to push past that for a second. Let's look at the truly difficult realities. What happens when a parent is dealing with severe behavioral issues, endless toddler tantrums, or complex special needs?
That's the heavy stuff.
Right, because one of the quiet, rarely acknowledged benefits of the traditional school system is that it provides a massive infrastructure of trained professionals. And frankly, a much-needed break for exhausted parents.
Yeah, absolutely.
How does a single parent at home manage that kind of load?
It's a huge question. Nagasako is emphatic that parents, not outsourced professionals, are often the most effective therapists for their own children.
Really?
Yeah.
Even for complex needs?
Yes. The book highlights organizations like Doman International and the TCU Purvis Institute, which focus entirely on equipping parents to deliver therapies at home.
Okay.
The book shares this really compelling anecdote about a father whose baby was experiencing severe developmental delays, struggling to crawl or walk. After traditional clinical therapies yielded little progress, the father learned the physical therapy techniques from Doman International.
And he did it himself.
Yes, he executed them at home, consistently, day in and day out,
Right.
and saw massive improvement.
Wow. Why does that work better than a clinic?
The mechanism behind why that works is neuroplasticity. Think about it. A clinical physical therapist might work with a child for 45 minutes, once or twice a week.
Right, which isn't a lot of time.
It's a tiny window for neurological rewiring. But a parent at home can execute 5 minutes of targeted therapy 10 times a day, 7 days a week. That relentless daily repetition in a safe, loving environment signals the brain to adapt much faster than sporadic clinical visits.
That makes total sense. And what about the psychological side? You mentioned the TCU Purvis Institute.
Right, which is known for trust-based relational intervention, or TBRI.
Yes. My understanding of that approach is that it completely shifts the paradigm from compliance to connection.
Exactly.
If a child with trauma or severe ADHD is throwing a massive tantrum, the traditional response is punishment or medication to force compliance. But the TBRI method trains the parent to look at the neurological trigger.
Yes. Is the child's nervous system dysregulated? Are they hungry? Are they overwhelmed by sensory input?
Right, so it moves the parent from acting as a warden to acting as a neurological detective.
I love that phrasing. And for high-energy children or those with incredibly short attention spans, Nagasako actually recommends abandoning the standard lesson format entirely.
So no 30-minute reading blocks?
None. You pivot to ultra-short micro-lessons. You do 3 minutes of intense flashcards, and then the child goes outside and sprints around the yard. You tailor the delivery to the biological reality of the child's nervous system.
Instead of demanding the child's nervous system conform to the rigid schedule of a classroom.
Exactly. And regarding tantrums, especially in those early toddler years, the advice is to simply let them happen safely.
Just let them scream it out.
Yeah. A tantrum is often just a young brain experiencing the friction of the word no and lacking the emotional vocabulary to process it. By allowing them to safely cry out that frustration at home without the panic of public embarrassment or the intervention of a school disciplinarian, they slowly build their own emotional regulation.
Okay, but it undeniably requires a monumental amount of energy from the parent. You forfeit the daily reprieve that school provides.
It does. It is exhausting.
So what's the reward?
Well, Nagasako argues that this investment yields the ultimate payoff. We aren't just talking about higher reading scores anymore. We are talking about the preservation of the parent-child bond.
Ah, because when a child is institutionalized for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week for 12 years, their primary social orientation naturally shifts from their family to their peer group.
Right. And that daily separation creates a gradual distance.
Yeah.
And that distance often detonates during adolescence. Teenagers in traditional settings frequently care far more about the opinions of their peers than the values of their parents.
Which is pretty standard, right?
It is in our culture. But by spending those thousands of hours together, navigating boredom, learning how to regulate emotions, and discovering the world side by side, you build a foundation of deep trust.
You are basically constructing a relational tether that is strong enough to survive the turbulence of the teenage years.
Exactly.
And we've covered incredible ground today. We started by dismantling the fear of falling behind, exploring how the math of individual attention naturally accelerates learning.
Right.
We looked at the cognitive science of unschooling and how intrinsic motivation physically builds better memory retention. We debunked the myth that parents need to be subject matter experts, and we explored the profound benefits of letting kids navigate their own boredom.
It's a huge paradigm shift.
It really is. It forces you to question the foundational structures of how we raise humans.
It does. And while we focus entirely on children and education today, the principles we've discussed have massive implications for adults.
Wait, really? What do you mean?
Well, think about the concept of the default mode network and the necessity of boredom. We understand now that a child's brain requires the friction of boredom to invent, to problem solve, and to develop independence.
Yeah.
But as adults, we have completely eradicated boredom from our lives.
Oh, wow. You're right.
The second we feel a moment of idle friction, like waiting in line for coffee, sitting at a red light, standing in an elevator, we instantly pull out our smartphones and flood our brains with external content.
We really do. We can't stand it for even a second.
Right. So if boredom is the biological incubation chamber for creativity and independent thought, what genius ideas, what profound personal insights, or what solutions to our own life problems are we actively destroying by refusing to let ourselves be bored?
Oh, man. That is a staggering thought. We are basically anesthetizing our own imaginations just as effectively as if we were sitting in a rigid, standardized classroom. So the next time you feel that desperate itch to reach for your screen in a waiting room, try to resist it. Let the default mode network turn on. Give your own mind the individual attention it's starving for. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us today. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep growing. We'll see you next time.